No one in the city of Ashford dared look this man in the eye. He owned everything: hotels, restaurants, even the streets people were afraid to walk after dark. The underworld called him the Quiet King. One look from him was enough to make anyone bow. But that night, Reed Calloway stood by the riverbank, holding a soaking wet sketchbook. And for the first time in 33 years, he had no idea what to say. In front of him was a girl who had nothing. No family, no money, no one to protect her. Just charcoal-stained hands and a pair of eyes that made it impossible for him to turn away. That night, the Quiet King was no longer a king. He was just a man, trying to pick up something his entire empire couldn't buy. This is their story. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. Reed Calloway stood beside the Great Wall of Glass in the penthouse on the top floor of the Calloway Grand Hotel. The city of Ashford lay beneath him like a glittering, illuminated map. The whiskey in his hand was already more than half gone, yet the cold inside his chest hadn't eased in the slightest. The room was vast, the ceiling high, and the silence was so complete that he could hear the ice softening in his glass. At 33 years old, Reed had everything a man could reach for. But every night, when the city lit up and the world outside drifted into sleep, he found himself standing here, alone, just as he had on every night before this one. A knock came at the door, brief and precise. Pierce stepped inside, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. At 38, this man was Reed's right hand, a former soldier, one of the very few people in the world who dared to look the Quiet King directly in the eye without lowering his head. Pierce set a file on the table, then spoke in a clipped voice. "There's trouble in the East District. Kessler is applying pressure." Reed didn't turn around. He took a sip of whiskey and answered in an even tone. "Kessler is always applying pressure. Leave him there. When it becomes a real problem, I'll know." Pierce nodded, but he didn't leave at once. He stood still for a moment, watching Reed from behind. That stance, that way of staring out through the glass as though he were searching for something among the countless lights, Pierce had seen it too many times. "There's one more thing," Pierce said. Tessa Vaughn sent another dinner invitation, the third time this month. Reed set his glass down on the window ledge. "Decline it." Pierce let out a quiet breath. "She isn't bad. Good family. Intelligent. Knows how to stand beside a man like you, without becoming a burden." "I don't need anyone beside me," Reed replied coldly. Pierce was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice lower now, slower, as though he had weighed every word before letting it leave his mouth. "You have the whole city, Reed, but this room is emptier than any alley out there." Reed said nothing. His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the glass. Pierce knew the line he couldn't cross. He gave a faint nod, turned, walked out, and closed the door behind him. The sound of his footsteps faded and disappeared into the long hallway. The room fell silent again. But Pierce's words didn't. They hung in the air, clinging to every corner of the walls, blending into the soft crack of ice in the whiskey glass, emptier than any alley out there. Reed stepped closer to the glass. Below, the city was still alive. He looked down at the lower apartment buildings. Warm yellow light spilled from small windows. Shadows moved within them, ordinary lives he could never quite touch. He turned away, poured another drink, sat down in the leather chair in the corner of the room, where no light reached. Reed Calloway, the Quiet King, the man before whom all of Ashford lowered its head, sat there in the dark, a glass in his hand, no one to speak to, no one waiting for him beyond the sitting room, no laughter, no warmth, not a single sign that this penthouse was a home, rather than nothing more than an expensive box suspended above the city. He finished the whiskey. Its bitter heat slid down his throat, but it didn't soothe anything at all. Pierce's words kept returning, and this time they came back clearer, heavier. "You have the whole city, but this room is emptier than any alley out there." Reed set the glass down, closed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, he didn't try to push that feeling away anymore. He let it remain there, whole, heavy, real. Loneliness wasn't loud. It didn't scream or pound on the door. It simply sat beside him, patient, still, as if it had been there for a very long time already, and knew he would never be able to send it away. The next morning, Reed didn't call Pierce. He didn't call anyone. He took his car keys, went down to the garage alone, and drove out of the city before the sun had fully risen. The black car moved through the streets of central Ashford, then turned onto the road leading toward the outskirts, where the houses grew sparser and the noise of the city fell away behind him. The cemetery sat on a low hill, small and quiet, the kind of place the living rarely remembered unless they had left someone there. Reed stopped the car, stepped out. In his hand, he carried a single flower, something simple, with no wrapping paper and no ribbon. He walked past rows of gravestones without looking to either side, his steps steady, as though he knew this path by heart. Then he stopped. The stone before him wasn't large, wasn't elegant, only a name, 2 numbers, and the space between them holding the weight of an entire life. Reed set the flower down. He didn't kneel, he didn't speak. He only stood there, both hands hanging at his sides, his eyes lowered to the stone as if he were listening for something that only silence could say. 1 minute, 2 minutes, perhaps longer. Time didn't matter in places like this. Then he turned away, didn't look back, walked to the car, opened the door, got in, and started the engine, just like every other time he came here. No words, no tears, only his presence, and the flower, and the silence he gave to the woman who had brought him into the world. On the drive back to the city, the road curved along a stretch by the river. Reed slowed down. His gaze moved past the window and down toward the old landing below. The wooden dock had rotted through in many places, and the trees on either side leaned low over the water. He knew this place, had known it for a very long time, from back when he was still a little boy sitting on his mother's shoulders, his legs swinging above the river, listening to the sound of her laughter. It was the last memory he still carried of her laugh. His hand rested on the steering wheel, his thumb tapping out a soft beat. The car slowed, but it didn't stop. He looked at the river landing for 1 second longer, then pressed the accelerator and let it slip behind the rearview mirror, growing smaller, then vanishing beyond the bend. It wasn't time yet, or perhaps he still wasn't ready to return to that place. Wasn't ready to remember anything more. The car drove on toward Ashford. The city skyline rose before him, the tall buildings reaching upward like fingers of steel. The Callaway Grand stood among them all, the tallest, the coldest. Reed looked at it and thought of the penthouse at the top. Empty, silent, waiting for him to come back, just like every day. He tightened his hand on the steering wheel and drove straight toward it, because other than that place, he had nowhere else left to go. That same night, on the other side of the city of Ashford, a 27-year-old woman was carrying a tray of food across the floor of Lumiere, her hands so practiced that she didn't need to look. Marin Soleil had been working the night shift here for nearly a year, longer than she had stayed anywhere before. She had passed through many cities, many jobs, many cheap rented rooms where the landlords never bothered to ask her name. Lumiere was the most stable place she had ever had, though the word stable in Marin's life didn't mean what it meant in other people's lives. The restaurant was crowded at night. Ashford's upper class came here to eat, to be seen, to prove they were wealthy enough for a dinner where the price of a single bottle of wine was equal to Marin's entire monthly pay. She moved between the tables like a shadow, quiet, light, drawing no attention, exactly the way she had learned to live for more than a decade. Since losing her parents when she was young, Marin had understood that a person with no one should do their best not to trouble anyone. She had just set down the third tray at table 7 when Helen Pratt's voice cut across the room from the bar. "Marin, come here." Marin set the tray down and walked over. Helen Pratt, one of the restaurant's co-managers, stood there with her arms folded across her chest, looking at Marin the way someone might look at a stain on a tabletop. Table 12 complained that their water was poured too slowly. "What exactly do you think you're doing here? Falling asleep on your feet?" "Yes. I'm sorry. I'll be more careful." Marin spoke softly, her eyes lowered. Helen didn't lower her voice, even though the guests at the next table had already turned to look. "Sorry doesn't pour water for you. Let this happen again, and I'll dock your pay. Is that clear?" "Yes, clear." Marin turned away and walked quickly back toward the water station. Her face didn't change. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had seen this too many times already, in too many places, from too many people. This kind of humiliation wasn't new anymore. It had only worn thin. Like an old wound, a person had grown so used to hurting that they forgot it was still bleeding. 2 other waitresses stood near the kitchen, whispering just loudly enough for Marin to hear as she passed. "That girl has no one close to her. No one checks on her. In all this time, have you ever seen anyone come pick her up? Poor thing. Marin walked past them. Didn't stop. Didn't react. She had learned that pity sometimes hurt more than scolding, because it reminded her of the truth she was always trying to forget. The night shift ended close to midnight. The restaurant began to empty. The staff cleaned up. Marin changed clothes in the employee room, then went out through the back door. The moment she pushed the door open, she saw Gordon Pratt standing there, his back against the wall, his hands in his pockets. He was Helen's husband, the other co-manager of the restaurant, and he had the kind of way of looking at women that Marin had recognized from the very first time she met him. "Finished for the night?" Gordon asked, his voice mild, but his eyes were not. "Out alone this late? And you're not afraid?" "I'm used to it," Marin answered shortly, stepping to one side to pass him. Gordon didn't move. He stayed there, one step closer than normal, close enough for Marin to catch the smell of cigarette smoke on his clothes. "A young girl like you shouldn't be out alone this late." His voice slowed, dropped lower. "If you ever need someone to take you home, just say so." Marin didn't look up. She slipped through the narrow space between him and the wall and walked quickly outside, her steps fast on the pavement but not running. She knew better than to run. Running meant fear, and fear gave people power. She turned onto the small road behind the restaurant and followed the riverbank. Her steps slowed when she reached the old wooden dock. She had found this place a few months earlier, the first time she got lost on the way home after a night shift. The dock was rotting. The trees leaned low over the water, and no one came here. Marin sat down, her feet touching the surface of the river. She opened the small sketchbook she always carried in her coat pocket, took out a pencil, and began to draw. There was no one around her. No Helen, no Gordon, no whispering voices. Only the sound of the water, the sound of the wind, and the sound of graphite moving across paper. This was the only time of day when Marin Soleil was allowed to be herself. 3 days later, Reed accepted the invitation to Lumiere, not because he wanted to, but because Tessa Vaughn was hosting the dinner there, and Lumiere belonged to the Callaway Holdings network. When the restaurant was his, refusing to appear too many times would become a story, and Reed didn't like giving people anything to talk about. He arrived 15 minutes late. Late enough that he wouldn't have to stand around waiting for anyone, late enough that everyone was already seated before he walked through the door. Pierce didn't come with him. This wasn't the kind of place that required a bodyguard. This was the kind of place that required patience. Tessa Vaughn was 30 years old, the daughter of a family with a known name among Ashford's upper class. She sat at the head of the table, exactly where she knew Reed would be placed right beside her. When he sat down, Tessa leaned slightly closer, her voice soft and self-assured. "I thought you weren't coming. I came because this is my restaurant," Reed replied, his eyes moving across the room. Tessa smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It was the kind that had been practiced, the right width, the right timing. She talked a great deal. Reed listened very little. She spoke about a trip to Europe, about a charitable project her family was funding, about the relationships she believed Reed ought to expand. He nodded when nodding was required, answered the questions that needed answering, but his voice remained as flat as water without a ripple. In the middle of dinner, Tessa placed her hand on the edge of the table, close to his but not touching. A deliberate move. "Let me be honest, Reed. You need a woman beside you. Someone worthy of that place. Someone who understands your world." Reed looked at her. Not cold, not warm. He simply looked, the way a man might look at a contract he already knew he would never sign. He didn't answer. He set his napkin on the table, stood, gave a brief nod to the others, and walked away. Tessa didn't call after him. She was smart enough to know that calling after a man like Reed Callaway in front of a crowd would only lower her in their eyes. But her gaze followed him, and in that gaze was something sharper than disappointment. Reed crossed the restaurant floor toward the exit. His steps were even, neither hurried nor slow. Then he stopped, not because someone called out to him, not because something blocked his way. He stopped because of a pair of eyes. Marin was standing beside the water station, a pitcher in her hand, preparing to pour for the next table. She looked up at the exact moment he passed. Their eyes met. 1 second. Perhaps not even a full second. Marin lowered her gaze at once, like the reflex of someone who had grown used to knowing she wasn't allowed to look directly into anyone's eyes for too long. She turned away and walked toward the guests' table, the water pitcher still steady in her hand, though her breathing had quickened by a single beat. Reed kept walking. Out the door, into the car. But on the drive home, he didn't think about Tessa. He didn't think about the dinner. He didn't think about the words about a woman worthy of standing beside him. He thought about those eyes, gray-blue eyes, tired but unwilling to go dark. He had seen those eyes somewhere before. He was certain of it, but his memory refused to give him the answer. Not yet. He drove in silence, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. That girl. He knew her. Or at least, he had seen her before. Somewhere, in some moment he couldn't name. And that, instead of helping him forget, only made him think of her more. 4 days after the dinner at Lumiere, Reed still couldn't sleep. Not because of Kessler, not because of work, but because of those eyes. The gray-blue eyes of the waitress he still couldn't remember where he had seen before. They lingered with him in a way he couldn't explain. Not quite an obsession, but something lighter than that, like an old melody heard in passing whose words he still couldn't fully recall. That night, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, Reed took his car keys and drove out of the city. He had no destination, or at least that was what he told himself. But when the car turned onto the road leading toward the outskirts, when the city lights began to fade and darkness spread over both sides of the road, he knew exactly where he was going. The river dock, the place he had driven past the last time without stopping. This time, he stopped. The engine went quiet. Silence rushed in. Reed opened the door and stepped out. The night air was cool, and the scent of the river drifted lightly on the wind. He walked down the small slope leading to the dock, his steps slow, unhurried, as if he were afraid that if he moved too fast, the memory would run from him. Then he stopped. Someone was there. A young woman sat on the old wooden dock, her bare feet touching the surface of the water, her back bent slightly forward. In her hands was a small sketchbook, and her pencil moved gently across the page. Moonlight spilled over the river and reflected against her face with a kind of soft, quiet radiance that seemed almost unreal. She didn't know someone was standing behind her. Reed stood still. He didn't move, didn't clear his throat, didn't take another step. He only stood there and watched. In all of his 33 years in this world, Reed Calloway had seen many things. Power, fear, greed, anger. But peace was rare. This girl had that. Sitting alone in the middle of the night, her feet in the water, her hand drawing across paper, she looked like someone who didn't belong to the world he lived in. No defenses, no calculation, no fear, only stillness, purity, and completeness. And Reed, the man before whom all of Ashford bowed its head, stood there as though he had been nailed in place. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't want to control the moment. He only wanted to stand inside it. Then his foot came down on a dry branch. The crack split sharply through the still night. Marin turned around. Her gray-blue eyes widened, and in that startled instant, the sketchbook slipped from her hands and fell into the river. "No!" Marin cried out, her voice trembling. She leaned forward, reaching for it, but the sketchbook had already drifted beyond her grasp. It was the only sketchbook she had. Every drawing, every pencil stroke, every moment she had kept for herself was inside it. Marin was just about to throw herself into the water when a shadow moved past her. Reed stepped straight down into the river, the water rising to his knees, and reached out to catch the sketchbook before it sank. He stood again, water streaming from his leather shoes, the legs of his suit trousers streaked with mud up to his thighs. In his hand, he held the soaked sketchbook with the care of someone carrying something fragile. He turned back, stepped up onto the dock, and handed it to her. Marin stood there, her eyes still wide, her breathing not yet steady. She looked at the sketchbook in his hand, then lifted her gaze to his eyes. Gray eyes. Cold. But in that moment, under the moonlight, they weren't as cold as she had imagined. Reed didn't smile. He didn't explain. He only said 2 words. "Be careful." Then he turned away, walked back up the slope, opened the car door, and got in. The engine came to life. The headlights swept once across the river dock, then the car rolled away and vanished into the darkness. Marin remained there alone, her arms wrapped tightly around the wet sketchbook against her chest, the water soaking through her clothes. But she didn't care. She didn't know who he was, didn't know his name, didn't know where he had come from, or why he had been there in the middle of the night. But those gray eyes, and the way he had stepped into the water without a second of hesitation, she would never forget. On the drive back, Reed drove in silence. The legs of his trousers were still wet. His hands were still cold. But he didn't think about the ruined suit or the waterlogged shoes. He thought about her, about the way she had sat beside the river, peaceful as if the world couldn't touch her there. About the gray-blue eyes that had lifted to his in that moment. Not frightened, not lowered, only startled. And he realized that these were the very eyes that had haunted him for the past several days. The girl in the restaurant, the girl at the river dock, they were the same person. The car slipped through the streets of Ashford and returned to the Callaway Grand. Reed entered the elevator, rose to the penthouse, and stood by the wall of glass. The city still lay beneath his feet, just as it did every night. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't look down. He looked into the distance, toward the outskirts, where the river dock was hidden in darkness. And he knew that something had just changed. 2 days after the night at the river dock, Pierce set a report on Reed's desk that morning. Lumiere has a problem. Revenue has dropped for 2 consecutive months. More employees are quitting than usual. There have been internal complaints, but no one has dealt with them. Reed turned through several pages. Who's managing it there? Gordon Pratt and his wife, Helen Pratt, Pierce answered. They've been running it for 3 years. It used to be fine, but over the past 6 months there have been signs of decline. Reed closed the report. I'm going tonight. Pierce looked at him. You've never personally gone to inspect Lumiere before. Reed didn't explain. He didn't explain it to himself either. Or perhaps he knew the reason, but didn't want to admit it. That night, Reed went to Lumiere alone. No notice in advance. No reservation. He entered through the side door, walked down the employee corridor, and took in everything with the eyes of a man long accustomed to judging people within seconds. The restaurant was in the middle of its busiest hour. Waitstaff moved quickly between the tables. The kitchen thundered behind the double doors. And there, in the middle of the dining room, he saw her. Marin was carrying a tray toward a table near the window. Her brown hair was neatly tied at the nape of her neck, her back straight, her steps light but quick. She set the plates down, said a few words to the guests, then turned away. And in the instant she turned, her eyes swept across the hallway. She saw him. Reed saw the moment she recognized him. Her eyes widened just a little. Her step slowed by half a beat. The girl from the river dock had recognized the man who had saved her sketchbook. And Reed, standing in the shadows of the corridor, recognized it too. It was her. The eyes from Tessa's dinner. The eyes by the river dock. The same person. He had finally found the answer his memory had owed him for days. Marin lowered her head and kept walking. Reed didn't go near her. He found a seat in a hidden corner and watched. Not watched her, watched everything around her. And what he saw didn't sit well with him. Helen Pratt moved from table to table, her mouth never stopping as she corrected the staff in a sharp, cold voice. One young waitress was scolded for bringing the wrong glass. One busboy was called back for moving too slowly. Helen didn't shout. She didn't need to shout. She used the kind of tone that made people understand that next time it wouldn't be only a warning. Reed saw the way the staff lowered their heads when Helen passed. It wasn't respect. It was fear. Then he saw Gordon. The middle-aged man stood at the end of the bar, a glass of water in his hand, and his eyes were not on the ledgers or the customers. His eyes were on the female staff. The way he looked gave nothing away only to himself, though he thought he was hiding it. Reed had seen enough kinds of men in his life to know exactly what that look meant. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He sat there for another 2 hours, watching, memorizing, waiting. Near the end of the shift, the restaurant began to empty. The staff started cleaning up. Marin went into the storage room behind the kitchen to get more tablecloths for the morning shift. She opened the storage room door and stepped inside. The tall shelves on both sides, the lighting dim. She had just reached toward the shelf when she heard footsteps behind her, then the sound of the door closing. She turned around. Gordon Pratt stood at the exit, his back against the door, his arms folded over his chest. He looked at her with the same expression she had seen too many times at the back door of the restaurant, but this time there was no way out beside him. "Working late, are you?" Gordon said, his voice slow. "You're far too diligent. I ought to repay you for that somehow. A girl all alone, with no one to care, no one to ask after her. You deserve to be treated better than that." Marin stepped back once. Her back touched the shelf. She wasn't trembling, or at least she refused to let herself tremble. She looked straight into his eyes and said, her voice clear, You need to leave. Gordon didn't move. The smile on his face didn't change. He opened his mouth to say more, but the storage room door opened. Not violently, not with a crash. It simply opened, slow and certain. Reed Calloway stood in the doorway. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His gray eyes looked straight at Gordon Pratt, and in that look was something everyone in Ashford's underworld knew well. It wasn't anger. Anger was loud. This was something quieter, heavier, more dangerous. Gordon turned around. His face changed color in an instant. He recognized who was standing before him. Not a customer, not a passerby. The owner, the quiet king. Mr. Bennett. I was only. Reed cut him off. Not with a raised voice, with a voice lower than breathing. Get out of this building. Don't ever come back. Gordon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His feet moved back one step, then another. Then he turned and hurried out of the storage room, down the corridor, out the back door, and disappeared into the night. No one in the restaurant ever saw him again after that night. Reed stood still for one moment more. Then he turned to look at Marin. She was still standing beside the shelf, her eyes wide, her breathing quick, but she wasn't crying. Her hand was clenched tightly around the tablecloth she had come to take. She looked at him, not the way she had looked at the man who saved her sketchbook at the river dock anymore. She was looking at someone else now, someone with the power to drive out the restaurant manager with one whispered sentence. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel, gratitude, fear, or both. Reed said nothing more. He gave a slight nod, turned, and walked away. That night, after leaving Lumiere, Reed called Pierce. It wasn't a long call. Reed never made long calls. The girl named Marine Soleil, the waitress at Lumiere, transfer her to an administrative assistant position at Calloway Holdings. Triple her current salary, starting Monday. On the other end of the line, there was silence for several seconds. Then Pierce asked, his voice calm though his words were chosen with care. Why? She's meticulous. I need someone like that in administration, Reed answered shortly. Pierce said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice lower now, slower. In 10 years of working for you, this is the first time I've seen you take an interest in anyone outside of business. Should I be worried or relieved? Reed didn't answer. He hung up. Pierce looked at the phone, let out a quiet breath, then began making arrangements. He didn't ask anything more, not because he wasn't curious, but because he had known Reed Calloway long enough to understand that once this man had decided, no question in the world was going to change anything. At Lumiere, the news of Gordon Pratt's disappearance spread faster than any gossip the restaurant had ever carried. The next morning, when the staff arrived for work, they found Helen Pratt standing alone behind the counter, her face pale, her eyes red, her jaw locked tight. No one dared ask. No one needed to. Everyone understood that when a manager vanished in the night without a single explanation, the answer was not something a waitress could reach. Helen didn't cry. She wasn't the type who cried. She was the kind of person who turned pain into anger and looked for someone to pour it onto, and that person was Marin. When Marin came to the restaurant that afternoon to receive notice of her transfer, Helen was already waiting by the back door. She looked Marin up and down, her gaze sharp as a paper cut. So you're leaving? Yes. Marin answered softly, her eyes lowered. Who do you think you are? Helen stepped closer, her voice low, but every word landed with weight. Just a little waitress the owner happened to find pleasing to look at. Don't flatter yourself into thinking you're special. Men like him are entertained quickly, and bored even quicker. Marin didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because she had heard too many words like that in her life, from too many people, in too many different places, to know that arguing wouldn't change anything. Helen's words wouldn't disappear just because she pushed back. They would still remain, clinging to her, just like every other word of the same kind that had come before. She only nodded, turned away, went upstairs to the staff room, and gathered her things. A small backpack. That was everything Marine Soleil owned after 27 years in this world. A small backpack, just large enough to hold a few changes of clothes. The sketchbook that had dried but still remained wrinkled after falling into the river. A pencil worn almost down to nothing, and nothing else. No family photographs, no keepsakes, no letters. Only the belongings of someone who had grown used to packing up her whole life in 10 minutes and leaving without looking back. She slung the backpack over her shoulder, walked down the stairs, and stepped out the back door for the last time. No one saw her off. No one said goodbye. A few coworkers looked after her, but no one spoke. In the world of waitstaff, people came and went like water slipping through open fingers, and no one had enough strength to keep anyone from leaving. Pierce was already waiting outside, leaning against the black car. He opened the back door for Marin without saying a word, only giving her a slight nod. Marin got into the car, sat down, and placed the backpack on her lap. The door closed. The car pulled away. Marin looked out through the window. Lumiere slowly receded behind her, growing smaller, then vanished beyond a bend in the road. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what an administrative assistant position really meant. She didn't know why the man from the river dock had chosen her, a waitress with no degree, no family, nothing except a pair of roughened hands and a water-stained sketchbook. She didn't know, and that frightened her more than it pleased her. Because in Marin's life, every time something good arrived, it was usually followed by something worse. She had learned that lesson too early, and she had never forgotten it. The car moved through the streets of Ashford. The evening light grew dimmer. Marin sat still, one hand gripping the strap of her backpack, her eyes fixed outside, though she wasn't really seeing anything at all. She only knew that she was leaving the old place behind, and the place she was going, she still didn't know what to call it. Not home. Not yet. The car stopped in front of the Callaway Holdings building. Marin stepped out, her backpack slung over one shoulder, lifted her eyes to the face of the building for a single second, then walked inside. She didn't allow herself to stand there and stare. She had learned that lingering too long in front of an elegant place when you didn't belong there only made people look at you longer. In the upper floor lobby, a woman was already waiting. She looked about 55 years old, small in frame, warm-eyed, her hands folded lightly in front of her. She smiled when she saw Marin step out of the elevator. "You're Marin, aren't you?" "I'm Mrs. Nguyen. Mr. Reed asked me to meet you." "Yes," Marin said with a nod, a little awkward because she wasn't used to being received by anyone. Mrs. Nguyen didn't ask many questions. She led Marin down the hallway, her voice gentle and natural, as though she were used to greeting people who had just arrived and understood that what they needed most in a moment like this wasn't questions, but reassurance. She stopped in front of a door, opened it, and stepped aside. "This is your room." Marin stepped inside. She stood still in the doorway. The room was larger than any place she had ever lived in during her life. She said nothing. She only stood there, one hand gripping the strap of her backpack, her eyes moving across the room before dropping to her old shoes against the spotless floor. The distance between those two things was so vast that she almost wanted to step back outside. Mrs. Nguyen stood behind her, watching. She didn't hurry her. She gave Marin time. Then she said softly, "Mr. Reed is a good man. It's just that no one has seen that yet." Marin turned to look at her. There was no judgment in Mrs. Nguyen's eyes. None of the look Marin had grown used to enduring at Lumiere. The look of people measuring how much she was worth. Mrs. Nguyen looked at her as if she were simply a person, and that, so simple it hurt, was something Marin hadn't been given in a very long time. "Thank you," Marin said quietly. Mrs. Nguyen nodded, then left. The next morning, Marin began work. The position of administrative assistant was unlike anything she had ever done before. No carrying trays, no wiping tables, no bowing her head before customers. Here the work was numbers, paperwork, arranging and cross-checking, expense ledgers, meeting schedules, internal reports, contact lists. Marin sat at her desk, reading each page of documents, making notes, sorting and classifying. Her hands were still rough from years of carrying trays, but her mind was quick. She understood numbers faster than she had expected. On her very first day, she found an error in a reconciliation sheet, a small figure the person before her had missed. She corrected it without telling anyone, only marking the margin before continuing. It was the first time in her life she had been allowed to do work that used her mind, instead of only her hands. And that feeling, though she didn't want to admit it, was good. Not the loud kind of good. The quiet kind, like drinking a mouthful of cool water after being thirsty for far too long. She didn't dare trust it completely, but she allowed herself to feel it for one moment. On the third day, Marin was walking down the hallway, carrying a file of documents. She turned the corner and saw Reed coming from the opposite direction. He was wearing a dark gray suit, his steps even, his eyes looking straight ahead. When the two of them came face to face, Reed gave a nod. Small, said nothing. Marin nodded back, just as small. She said nothing too. Then they passed one another. That was all. No long greeting, no questions, no effort to force a conversation into being. Only two nods in an empty hallway, and the sound of footsteps fading in opposite directions. But Marin noticed one small thing. When Reed nodded to her, his eyes weren't the same as the way he looked at anyone else she had seen in this building. Not cold, not warm, something in between, so slight it was almost nothing, yet enough for her to notice. The distance between them was still there, still clear, still proper, but it had grown thinner now, thin enough for her to feel that on the other side, there was someone looking at her not with pity and not with calculation, but with something she still didn't dare name. News doesn't need legs to run, it only needs a mouth. And in Ashford's upper circles, mouths are never in short supply. Less than a week after Marin moved to Callaway Holdings, the story had spread across every coffee table, every lunch gathering, every phone call between women with too much time and too little to do. And the one who set it in motion was none other than Tessa Vaughn. Tessa knew before most people did. She had connections inside the Callaway system, acquaintances at Lumiere, and ears that lifted the moment Reed Callaway's name was mentioned. When she heard that a waitress had suddenly been moved into an administrative assistant position right beside the Quiet King's office, Tessa said nothing for 30 seconds. Then she set her coffee cup down, smiled, and began to talk. At a weekend gathering in an exclusive club on the west side of Ashford, Tessa sat among a group of familiar women, her voice light, natural, as if she were sharing an amusing story rather than planting poison. "Have you all heard? That waitress from Lumiere, Reed Callaway, personally transferred her. Administrative assistant. Triple the salary." One of the women raised an eyebrow. "A waitress? Does she have any qualifications?" Tessa tilted her head, her smile unchanged. "Do you really think she was chosen for her abilities? A girl with no family, no one to vouch for her, no one who even knows where she came from, suddenly sitting beside the Quiet King?" She didn't need to say more. The looks around the table completed the story on their own. Each person would go home and tell a few others. Each of those would add another detail. And by the end of the week, the story had become something entirely different from the truth. At Lumiere, Marin's former co-workers added their part, not because they hated her, but because when one of them was suddenly lifted up, the others felt themselves lowered without meaning to. "I've worked here longer than she has," one waitress said during a break. "No one's ever offered to move me anywhere." "That's because you don't have what she has," another replied, her voice edged with sarcasm. No one said clearly what that was, but everyone understood. And that kind of understanding was more cruel than any direct accusation, because it needed no proof, no explanation, and no one had to take responsibility for saying it. At Callaway Holdings, Marin felt the change with each passing day. Not loudly, no one said anything to her face, but she noticed. The way conversations stopped when she entered the break room, the way eyes slid over her and then away, quicker than usual, as if looking at her too long might leave something behind, the way a few employees smiled at her, but the smiles never reached their eyes. Marin didn't push back, didn't explain, didn't go to anyone to say that things weren't the way they thought. She knew explanations didn't work, because people don't believe what they hear. They believe what they want to believe. Instead, she worked harder, arrived earlier, left later, checked the ledgers more carefully, lowered her head further, as if she worked well enough, quietly enough, invisibly enough, the whispers would fade on their own. But they didn't fade. They only softened just enough that she could still hear them, but could never point to where they came from. That kind of pain left no visible wound. It only wore a person down, slowly, evenly, a little more each day. That night, Marin sat in her room by the window. The city of Ashford glittered outside, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the glass, at her own reflection, a 27-year-old woman, tired eyes, shoulders slightly bent, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack as if she still hadn't dared to fully unpack it in this place. What am I doing here? No one asked her that question. She asked it herself, and she had no answer. She didn't know whether Reed Callaway had brought her here because he saw ability in her, or for some other reason she didn't dare to think about. She didn't know whether she was being helped or stepping into something beyond her strength. She only knew that behind her back, people were talking, and ahead of her, nothing was certain. Marin let go of the strap of her backpack, leaned her head against the glass, and closed her eyes. Am I lying to myself? The question hung in the dark. No one answered. 1 week later, late one evening, Marin brought a file of documents up to the penthouse. Reed had asked for the third quarter expense reconciliation before 9 o'clock the following morning, and she wanted to place it on his desk before going back to her room. She knocked. No one answered. She pushed lightly, and the door wasn't locked. Inside, Mrs. Nguyen was clearing the dining table, where 2 plates had already been set out, steam still rising from the food. She turned when she saw Marin and smiled. "Come in, dear. I've just finished cooking, and Mr. Reed will be back soon. Stay and eat with us. I made extra." Marin hesitated. "I only came to drop off the documents. It's already set, Mrs. Nguyen said, her voice gentle but not in a way that invited refusal. "Sit down. It would be a shame to let hot food grow cold." Marin placed the file on the shelf by the door, then sat down. She didn't feel at ease. The dining table was long, the porcelain plates white, the glassware polished until it shone. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, like a guest trying not to touch anything that didn't belong to her. Mrs. Nguyen poured water, then left, and the room fell quiet. A few minutes later, the door opened. Reed stepped inside. He stopped when he saw Marin seated at the table. It was a brief moment, just long enough for both of them to understand that no one had arranged this. "Mrs. Nguyen made extra," Marin said, as though she needed to explain herself. Reed gave a slight nod. He took off his suit jacket, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down across from her. He asked nothing more. Dinner began in silence, the sound of silverware touching plates, the sound of water being poured. Neither of them spoke. But it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't yet know where to begin. Marin ate slowly. She looked at Reed from across the table. He ate without hurry, his eyes lowered slightly, his shoulders carrying a faint weariness. He looked different here. Not the quiet king, not the man the whole building bowed to, just a man eating dinner alone, or almost alone, in a room far too large for one person. Then Marin spoke. Not because she had planned to, but because the words had been sitting inside her from the day she stepped into this building, and tonight, in this silence, they found their own way out. "You have everything people dream of, but every time I look at you, you seem like you're missing something." Reed stopped eating. His silverware came to rest on the plate. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting her gray-blue ones, and in that moment, neither of them looked away. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, long enough for Marin to think she had said the wrong thing. Then Reed set his utensils down, leaned back in his chair, and spoke. His voice was low, slow, spare. "My mother died early. My father became seriously ill not long after. I had 2 younger siblings, and I had to take care of everything myself from a very young age." He stopped, not because there was nothing more to say, but because he was weighing how much he wanted to say. Then he continued, "I did everything I could to make sure my brother and sister got an education, to get them out of this city, to give them a normal life, a clean life, the kind of life I never had. And I did it. They're both doing well now. They're living good lives. That's the only thing I'm proud of." Marin listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask how his mother died. She didn't ask what illness his father had. She simply sat there, silent, listening as though this were a privilege and not an ordinary conversation. Reed looked down at his glass of water. "I built all of this so no one in my family would ever have to live in lack again," he said, his voice softer now. "But in the end, the one who has lacked the most is me." The words fell onto the dinner table like a small stone dropped into still water. Not loudly, but the ripples spread very far. Marin didn't speak at once. She looked at him, and in that moment, she didn't see the quiet king anymore. She saw a man who had carried too much too early, who had built too high, and now stood at the top, looking down without being able to find the road back to the ground. There was another stretch of silence. Then Reed asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, "Why were you drawing by the river that night?" Marin took a breath. She looked down at her hands, at the faint traces of graphite still marking the tips of her fingers. Then she lifted her gaze, looked straight into his eyes, and answered, "Because that was the only time no one looked at me with pity. No one judged me. No one whispered behind my back. There, I was only myself." Reed looked at her. For a long time, he said nothing, but something in his eyes changed. Not much, just enough for Marin to notice. Like a door opening another millimeter. Not enough to see what was inside, but enough to know that beyond it, there wasn't the emptiness everyone had always imagined. Dinner ended in silence. Marin stood, gave a small nod of farewell, and walked to the door. Reed didn't rise to see her out. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, he spoke. "You don't have to explain to anyone why you're here." Marin stopped. She didn't turn around. "I know," she answered softly. Then she opened the door and left. Reed remained seated alone. The long dining table stretched before him, 2 finished plates, 2 glasses of water half emptied. For the first time in a very long while, that table no longer looked too large. After that dinner, neither of them ever mentioned what had been said. Not Reed, not Marin, as though they had silently agreed that that night had been a door, opened a crack and then gently closed again, and neither of them was ready yet to push it any wider. The weeks that followed passed in their familiar distance, polite, professional, proper. Marin did her work, Reed did his. They met in the hallway, nodded, and passed by. They met in conference rooms when she brought documents. He received them, thanked her, and she left. There were no more dinners, no conversations that lasted more than a few sentences. From the outside, nothing had changed. But both of them knew that wasn't true. Because they had begun to read each other, not through words, through things smaller than words. Marin noticed that Reed drank black coffee when his mood was heavy. On the days he sat in his office early, the door closed, his voice lower than usual when he spoke with Pierce on the phone. There was always a cup of black coffee on his desk. No sugar, no cream, and he drank it to the last drop. But on the days he walked a little faster, nodded more openly to the staff, his eyes a little brighter, the cup of coffee remained untouched on the desk, gone cold, forgotten. She told no one about this. She simply knew it, and that knowledge rested quietly inside her like a small secret she had no intention of sharing. Reed read Marin too. He noticed that she hid her hands behind her back when she was uneasy. Whenever someone looked at her for too long, or whenever she had to step into a crowded room, her hands would automatically fold together behind her back, as if she were hiding the most vulnerable part of herself, and he noticed her smile. Marin didn't smile often, but sometimes, when Mrs. Nguyen said something gently amusing while bringing in tea, or when Marin found an error in the ledgers she had been chasing all day, the right corner of her mouth would lift slightly, only one side, so faint that anyone who wasn't paying attention would miss it. But Reed paid attention. And every time he saw that small, one-sided smile, he realized he was looking longer than he should. Then he would turn away, because Reed Calloway wasn't the kind of man who allowed himself to look at anyone for too long. He had lived his whole life by controlling everything, including his own gaze, but that control was beginning to crack. One afternoon, Reed walked past the employee break room. The door was slightly open. Marin was sitting alone at the small table during her break, her sketchbook open in front of her, a pencil in her hand. She was drawing. Reed stopped. He didn't step inside. He stood outside the door and looked through the narrow opening. The drawing on the page was the Ashford skyline. The tall buildings, the wide sky, the ground below. But the point of view was different. She had drawn the city from below, looking up, from the ground, from the angle of someone standing by the river dock and lifting their head toward the towers, not from above looking down, not the view Reed had known for so many years, standing at the top of the Calloway Grand and looking at the city as though it belonged to him. She was looking at the same city, but from the opposite side of it entirely. Reed stood there longer than he intended. His eyes rested on the drawing, on the way she held the pencil, on the lines moving across the page. He said nothing. He didn't knock. He didn't go in. Then he turned away and continued down the hallway in silence. Marin never looked up, but she knew. She recognized the shadow of someone pausing outside the door, recognized the hesitation in the footsteps before they faded away. She knew it was him, not because she had seen him, but because in this building, there was only one person who walked in a way that made the floor almost completely silent. She didn't lift her head. She didn't stop drawing either, but the right corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Only a little, and if Reed had remained there for half a second longer, he would have seen it, but he was already gone. The distance between them was still there, still clear, still uncrossed. But it was growing thinner, a little more each day, through things neither of them ever said aloud. While Reed and Marin were quietly being drawn closer to one another through the things left unspoken, something else was drawing near beyond the walls of Callaway Holdings. Kessler had not stopped. From the moment Pierce first mentioned that name on the first night in the penthouse, Reed had known that sooner or later he would have to deal with him. But he had not moved against him yet, because Kessler had not been foolish enough to cross the line, until now. Pierce placed a stack of photographs on Reed's desk that morning. Long-distance shots. Marin walking along the sidewalk. Marin stepping out of the building. Marin standing outside the corner coffee shop. Kessler is watching her. "Who took these?" Reed asked, his voice unchanged, but his hand resting on the desk tightened. "Kessler's men," Pierce answered. "We discovered it last week. They're looking for your weak point, and they think they've found it." Reed looked at the photographs. In every single one, Marin had no idea she was being watched. She was simply living, walking, existing, and someone was turning that ordinary existence into a weapon. He pushed the photographs aside. "Protect her. 24 hours a day. She is not to know." Pierce nodded, then left. From that day forward, Marin never truly went anywhere alone again, though she didn't know it. Pierce assigned men to follow her from a distance, discreetly, professionally. Not enough for her to notice. Not enough for anyone to notice. Everything continued as normal until Thursday night. Marin left the building later than usual. She had stayed to finish the third quarter account reconciliation, and by the time she stepped outside, the streets were already quiet. The streetlights cast a pale yellow glow across the wet pavement after the afternoon rain. She walked quickly, her hands in her coat pockets, her head slightly lowered. She had been used to walking alone late at night for a very long time. But tonight, something was different. She heard footsteps. Behind her. Not far. Not close. Steady. Marin did not turn around. She quickened her pace. The footsteps behind her quickened too. Her heart began to beat faster. She turned right into a narrow street. The footsteps still followed. She turned again into an alley, and stopped, because Pierce was already standing there. He was leaning back against the wall, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes looking straight over Marin's shoulder toward the mouth of the alley. Calm. Certain. As if he had been standing there for an hour already. Marin turned to look back toward the mouth of the alley. No one was there. The footsteps had vanished. The shadow had dissolved into the night. Someone had seen Pierce, and decided that tonight was not the right night. Pierce stepped forward, his voice low. "I'm taking you home." Marin looked at him. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "You've been following me?" "I've been protecting you," Pierce answered, offering no further explanation. He led her back to the main road, called a car, and took her back to the Callaway Holdings building in silence. Marin sat in the car, her hands clenched tightly on her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. She was shaking. But she didn't cry. She had lived through too many frightening nights in her life to still believe that tears could stop anyone's footsteps. The next morning, Marin went straight up to the penthouse. She didn't knock on Reed's office door. She pushed it open and walked in. Reed was standing by the wall of glass, his back turned. He turned when he heard the door. His eyes met hers. He knew that she knew. Marin stood in the middle of the room, both arms at her sides, not hidden behind her back the way they usually were. This time she was hiding nothing. "You had someone follow me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Reed looked at her. 3 seconds of silence. "I had someone protect you." Marin didn't blink. "Protect me or keep me?" The question fell into the space between them. Reed did not look away. He looked straight at her, his gray eyes neither cold nor warm, only honest. "What kind of man do you think I am?" Silence. Long. Heavy. Marin looked at him. He looked at her. Neither gave way. Neither explained anything more. Then Marin turned away. She walked to the door, opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind her. She gave him no answer. Reed stood still, staring at the closed door. Her question remained hanging in the room. Protect me or keep me? He knew the answer. But he also knew that the answer, if spoken aloud, would change everything. And Reed Callaway had never feared anyone in Ashford. But tonight, standing alone in the empty room, he was afraid. Afraid that the girl who drew by the river would look at him and see what the whole city saw. Afraid that she would be right. 3 days after the confrontation in the office, Marin and Reed didn't speak. It wasn't the familiar silence of two people keeping a careful distance. It was a silence with thorns in it. She still worked. He still worked. But when they passed each other in the hallway, neither of them nodded. The question Maren had left unanswered still hung between them, growing heavier with each day. On Wednesday night that week, Maren left the office close to 10 o'clock. She had gone halfway back to her room before she realized the third quarter file was still on her desk. The final reconciliation Reed needed the next morning. She turned back. The building was quiet. The hallway was long. The corridor lights dimmed into night mode, giving off a pale yellow glow just bright enough to see by. Her footsteps sounded softly against the floor. She walked quickly, wanting only to retrieve the file and leave. Then she heard voices. At the far end of the hall, from the large conference room, the door was pulled to, but not fully shut, and light spilled through the narrow opening. Maren slowed. She hadn't meant to stop. But then she heard Reed's voice. She had heard that voice many times before. In the hallway, in the office, across the dinner table that night, but Reed's voice tonight was unlike any time before. It was lower, slower, each word laid down as if placing a stone on a scale. Exact, heavy, without a single wasted syllable. Maren stopped a few steps from the door. She didn't want to look, but her feet wouldn't carry her on. Through the narrow gap, she could see the room. Reed stood at the head of the table. He wasn't sitting. He was standing, both hands in his trouser pockets, his back straight, his eyes lowered toward a man seated across from him. The man wasn't young. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but sitting in front of Reed, he looked like someone shrinking in on himself. His shoulders were bent. His hands were clasped together on the table. His fingers locked so tightly they had gone white. His voice trembled. Maren couldn't make out every word, but she heard enough to understand. He was begging for more time, begging for one more chance, begging Reed not to do the thing they both knew he was capable of doing. There were several others around the table. None of them moved. None of them looked up. They sat in silence like shadows, their eyes fixed on the tabletop, as if lifting their heads would make them noticeable. And to be noticed in that room was not a good thing. Reed listened until the gray-haired man had finished speaking. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He simply stood there in silence until the man had reached his last word and fallen quiet, his strained breathing filling the room. Then Reed spoke. One sentence. Only one. Maren couldn't hear exactly what the words were, but she saw the reaction. The gray-haired man closed his eyes as if he had just taken a blow from a hand no one had raised. The others at the table lowered their heads even further, and Reed turned away and began walking toward the door, calm, composed, as if he had just concluded a conversation about the weather. Maren stepped back. Fast, light, she slipped into the corner of the hallway before the door opened. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She didn't wait any longer. She turned and walked quickly down the hall, into the elevator, down to the lobby, and out of the building. She didn't retrieve the file. She didn't look back. She kept walking, fast, then faster. The night wind was cold, but she didn't feel it. In her mind there was only one image. Reed standing at the head of the table, his gray eyes neither cold nor warm, only empty. Empty the way a man's eyes become when he has done something too many times to feel anything about it anymore. That was not the man who had saved her sketchbook by the river, not the man who had sat at dinner and spoken about his younger siblings. That was the Quiet King, and the Quiet King was frightening. Maren walked to the river dock, not because she chose to go there, but because her feet carried her back to the only place where she felt safe. She sat down on the old wooden dock, though this time her feet didn't touch the water. She only sat there, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the dark river. She didn't know how much time had passed before she heard footsteps. Slow, light, familiar. Reed stood a few steps away from her. He didn't sit. He didn't come any closer. He knew she had seen. Maren didn't look up. She said, her voice low and faintly trembling, "I don't know who you are." Reed was silent for a moment. Then he answered, his voice low, with no defense in it, no explanation. "You already do. You just didn't want to look at it." Maren stayed still. The wind moved over the river dock, and the surface of the water shivered softly. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask why, wanted to hear him deny it, or apologize, or say anything that might give her a reason to stay. But he said nothing else, and neither did she. Maren stood up. She didn't look at him. She walked away, across the dock, up the slope, and out to the road. She didn't turn back. Reed remained by the river, alone. The water reflected his shape, distorted, dark. He looked down, then looked toward the direction she had gone. The road was empty. She was gone. And for the first time in his life, Reed Calloway didn't know whether someone who walked away would come back. And he didn't know when it had started to matter so much. Marin returned to the Calloway Grand close to midnight. She took the elevator up to her room, opened the door, and turned on the light. The room was exactly as she had left it that morning. The bed was neat. The table was clean. There was no sign of anyone else but her. She pulled her backpack out from beneath the bed. The small backpack she had never fully unpacked, never truly opened all the way in this place, as though some part of her had always known that one day she would need to pick it up and leave. Today was that day. She opened the closet, took out a few changes of clothes, folded them neatly, and slipped them into the backpack. A toothbrush, a spare pencil. Nothing more than that. Marin Soleil's whole life still fit into one backpack, just as it had every other time, in every city before this one, after every leaving that had come before. Then her hand touched the sketchbook. She stopped. It was lying on the bedside table, where she always kept it, within easy reach. The cover was still slightly warped from the night it had fallen into the river. Marin picked it up and sat down on the edge of the bed. She turned a page. The first drawing, the river dock at midnight, water and moonlight. The next page, the Ashford skyline seen from below. The next, hurried sketches from lunch breaks, the corner of a table, a cup of coffee, a window frame. Then she turned to a page she didn't remember drawing. A face. Angular lines, but not hard. Eyes looking downward, not at the viewer, as though looking into something within himself. Shoulders carrying a faint weariness. One hand resting beside a glass of water on the table. It was Reed, not the quiet king, not the man standing at the head of the conference table tonight, his voice heavy as stone, his eyes empty as a deep well. This was Reed as he had been sitting across from her at dinner, when he had spoken about his mother, about his younger siblings, when he had said that in the end, the one who had lacked the most was himself. This was Reed with his guard down. Marin looked at the drawing for a long time. Her fingers moved lightly across the graphite lines. She didn't know when she had drawn it. Perhaps on some sleepless night, when that image had kept rising in her mind, and her hands had found their way to a pencil on their own. She couldn't explain why she had drawn it. She only knew that this drawing felt truer than any other in the sketchbook. She closed the book, slipped it into the backpack, pulled the zipper shut, stood up. Then the building shook. A loud explosion tore up from somewhere below, from the basement levels, deep and heavy, as though the ground beneath her feet had coughed once. The lights flickered twice, then died. Darkness rushed in. The alarm system split through the silence with a shrill, steady cry. Marin stood in the middle of the room in complete darkness. She heard shouting in the hallway, running footsteps, doors slamming shut, then the smell of smoke, faint at first, like paper burning somewhere far away, then thicker, slipping through the crack beneath the door, finding its way into her nose, and everything stopped. Not the world outside, the world inside Marin. The smell of smoke carried her back to that night. The night she had lost everything. She no longer saw the room at the Calloway Grand. She saw another darkness. The darkness from many years ago, when she was told that the house was gone, her parents were gone, and from that second on, her life would never again be what it had been before. Her legs gave way. She slid down onto the floor, her back against the side of the bed. The backpack slipped from her hand. The sketchbook rolled across the floor, but she didn't reach for it. She wrapped her arms around her knees and folded inward, smaller and smaller, as though if she curled tightly enough, the darkness wouldn't be able to find her. Her breathing shortened, quickened, her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The alarm kept screaming. The smell of smoke kept growing heavier. And there in the darkness, in the chaos, in the old fear rushing back over her like a wave, Marin Soleil did something she had not done in all those many years. She called for her mother, very softly, barely even a sound, only a breath shaped like a word. Mom. No one heard. No one answered. There was only darkness and smoke and the wail of the alarm, and a 27-year-old woman curled on the floor, clutching her knees, trembling, alone. Reed was at the southern harbor of Ashford when his phone rang. Pierce. Only one phrase. Callaway Grand. An incident. Marin is still in the building. Reed said nothing. He ended the call, got into the car, and drove. Fast. The streets of Ashford at midnight were empty, red lights slipping past like dim streaks of color. He didn't stop at a single one. When the car reached the Callaway Grand, he saw emergency vehicles, rotating lights, evacuees standing on the sidewalk, security staff with flashlights directing people out. Thin smoke was rising from the basement ventilation shafts, light but enough to leave its smell in the street. Reed parked, stepped out, and Pierce was already waiting at the entrance. Incident in the basement mechanical room. It's being contained. The emergency team is already inside, Pierce said quickly, sharply. Where is Marin? Not confirmed yet. She's not on the evacuation list. Reed looked at the building. Darkness covered everything from the third floor upward, the electrical system already cut. Light smoke drifted past a few open windows. He moved toward the main entrance. Pierce stepped in front of him. Reed, the rescue team is going in. You shouldn't go in yourself. Reed looked at Pierce. He didn't say anything. He only looked at him. And Pierce, the man who had followed Reed for 10 years, the man who had stood beside him through nights far worse than this one, understood. He stepped aside. Reed entered the building. The stairwell was dark. Thin smoke hung in the air, not thick, but enough to sting the eyes. He climbed the stairs, using his phone flashlight, the white beam sweeping over each step. He went up floor by floor, calling her name. Marin. His voice echoed through the empty hallway. No answer. He kept going. The next floor. Marin. Silence. Only the alarm, now fading weakly, the sound of water dripping somewhere, and the sound of his own footsteps. He reached her floor. The hallway was completely dark. Thin smoke drifted at eye level like mist. Reed moved down the hall, the flashlight passing over each door. He came to her room. The door was half open. He pushed it wider. The flashlight shone inside, and he saw her. Marin was sitting on the floor, her back against the side of the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Her sketchbook lay on the floor beside her, open to a page, the pencil lines glimmering faintly under the flashlight. The backpack lay a few steps away, unzipped, clothing visible inside. She had been preparing to leave before the incident happened. Her eyes were open, but she didn't see him. She was staring straight ahead, into the darkness, into something only she could see. Her eyes were here, but she was not. She was inside a memory, in the night from so many years ago, inside that smell of smoke, inside that darkness, inside the loss she had never truly walked out of. Reed set the phone down on the floor, angling the flashlight toward the ceiling so the light spread softly enough that neither of them was swallowed by the dark. He knelt in front of her, slowly, gently, like a man approaching a frightened bird. Marin, look at me. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed open. Her breathing stayed fast, shallow, broken. Her hands were gripping the fabric of her trousers, her fingers white with strain. Reed took her hand, gentle but firm. His hand was warm. Hers was ice cold. He held on and did not let go. Look at me. You're here. With me. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding. It wasn't the voice of the quiet king. It was the voice of a man who was afraid, and for the first time in his life, couldn't hide it. Marin blinked. Once. Twice. Her gray-blue eyes slowly came back into focus. She looked down, saw his hand holding hers. Then she looked up, saw his eyes. Gray. Close. Afraid. Real. And she broke. Not in a loud way. Not with screaming or sobbing. Only tears. Falling from eyes she had kept dry for so many years. Silent. No sound of crying. Only tears, trailing down her cheeks, falling onto his hand, warm against cold skin. Marin Soleil, the girl who had never cried in front of anyone, cried, in the darkness, in front of the man she had been planning to leave. Reed said nothing. He pulled her into his arms, both of his arms wrapped around her shoulders, tight, secure, as if he were holding on to something he feared would disappear if he let go. She cried into his shoulder. He held her in the darkness. The alarm had gone silent. The smoke was fading. The building stood quiet around them as though the whole world had withdrawn to make room for this moment. Then Reed spoke. Very softly. Softer than any order he had ever given. Softer than the words with which he had sent Gordon out of the restaurant. so soft that if Marin had not been in his arms, she would never have heard it. "Don't go. Don't leave me alone." Reed Calloway, the Quiet King, the man before whom all of Ashford bowed its head, kneeling on a dark floor, holding a girl who had nothing, and asking her not to leave. Marin lifted her head. Her eyes were red, wet, exhausted, but she looked at him, truly looked at him, not at the Quiet King, not at her employer, not at the frightening man in that dark conference room. She looked at Reed. Only Reed. Their first kiss. In the darkness, between the faint smell of smoke and the cold floor. Not perfect, not romantic the way it is in films, but real. More real than anything either of them had ever had in their lives. And when they drew apart again, only a few inches, their breath mingling in the darkness, both of them knew. There was no road back anymore. The first light of morning slipped through the curtains when Marin opened her eyes. She didn't recognize where she was lying. The ceiling was higher than the one in her room. The sheets were softer. The air was clean, with no trace of smoke left in it. She blinked several times, and the memory of last night returned in fragments. Darkness, the alarm, the smell of smoke, and warm hands pulling her up from the cold floor. She turned her head to the side. Reed was sitting in the chair beside the bed. He was still wearing the suit from the night before, wrinkled and stained. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, the kind that belonged to a man who had sat through the whole night without closing them. But he was looking at her, and when her eyes met his, he said nothing. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask if she had slept. He only looked at her, and in that look was something Marin had never seen in him before. Relief, the kind of relief that came from someone who had been afraid of losing something and had just realized it was still there. She looked at him. He had stayed here all night. He hadn't sent Pierce. He hadn't called Mrs. Nguyen. He had sat here himself, in the chair beside her bed, watching over her while she slept. The Quiet King, the man before whom the whole city bowed its head, sitting through the night watching over a sleeping girl without resting for even a moment. A soft knock came at the door. Pierce stepped in, his eyes moving briefly over Marin before settling on Reed. His expression didn't change. He made no comment about Reed sitting beside her bed all night. Pierce was the kind of man who understood without needing anyone to explain. "Kessler," Pierce said, his voice even and clipped. "It's done. He's no longer a problem." Reed nodded. One single nod. He didn't ask what done meant. He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask how many people, where, or by what method. He only nodded, and that was enough. Pierce looked at him for half a second longer. Then he turned, walked out, and closed the door. His footsteps faded down the hallway. The room fell silent again. Only the two of them remained. Marin slowly sat up and leaned back against the headboard. Her hair was tousled, her eyes still slightly swollen from the night before. She looked down at her hands. Then she looked up at Reed. He was still sitting in the chair, an arm's length away, close enough to touch, but not touching. "I saw you that night," Marin said, her voice soft but not trembling. "In the conference room, I was standing out in the hallway, looking through the crack in the door. I saw the way people were afraid of you. I saw the way you spoke without ever raising your voice. And the whole room fell silent. I know who you are." Silence. Reed looked at her. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He didn't say that she had misunderstood, or that she hadn't understood everything, or that there were reasons. He only looked at her and waited. "And you're still here," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a fact he still didn't entirely trust. Marin was silent for a moment. She looked into his eyes, those gray eyes darkened by a sleepless night, and she saw there what she had seen on the dark floor the night before. Fear. Not fear of Kessler. Not fear of the incident. Fear of her. Fear that she would get up, take her backpack, and leave, just like everyone else before her. "I'm not here because of who you are," Marin said, her voice clear, slow, each word placed down like stone. "I'm here because I saw that you were afraid of losing me." Reed didn't move. Marin continued. One more sentence, the last one she needed to say. "People aren't afraid of losing what they want to control. They're afraid of losing what they love." The words fell into the quiet room. They didn't echo. They weren't dramatic. They were only true. So true that nothing else was needed after them. Reed said nothing. His jaw tightened. His eyes never left hers. Then his hand reached out, slowly, and took hers, held it more tightly than he had the night before, more tightly than he had ever held anything in his life. Not the grip of a man controlling, the grip of a man afraid to let go. Maren didn't pull her hand back. She let her hand remain in his. Warm, steady. The two of them sat there in the early light and said nothing more. They didn't need to. A few days later, dawn had not fully broken yet. The sky in the east had only just begun to shift from black to a pale gray, the kind of gray that belongs to those last moments before the first sunlight touches the earth. The old river dock was still there, the weathered wooden planks, the trees leaning low over the water, the river moving slowly as if it had nowhere it needed to hurry toward. A light wind, flowing water. Silence. Maren sat on the dock, her feet nearly touching the surface of the river, her sketchbook open across her lap, a pencil in her hand. She was drawing. Reed sat beside her. He said nothing. He didn't look at the sketchbook. He looked out at the river, both hands resting on his knees, his back leaning slightly behind him. For the first time, he was sitting in a place without needing to control it, without needing to own it, without needing to know who it belonged to or how much it was worth. He was simply sitting there, beside her, and that was enough. The sound of graphite moving across paper came soft and steady between the sounds of the water. Maren didn't draw in haste. Each line, each stroke, came slowly, as though she were saying something that words couldn't carry. Then she stopped, looked at the drawing for a moment, then gently tore the page from the sketchbook and held it out to Reed. Reed took it. He looked down. On the page was a face. His face. But not the quiet king, not the man before whom all of Ashford bowed its head, not the cold gray eyes people feared. This was a different face. Eyes lowered, soft, unguarded, shoulders relaxed. The line of his jaw was still angular, but no longer hard. This was Reed when he wasn't controlling, when he didn't need to control, when he was only a man sitting across from her at dinner and, for the first time in his life, speaking aloud the things he had never said to anyone. Reed looked at the drawing for a long time. His fingers held the edge of the page carefully, as though he were afraid the wind might carry it away. Then he spoke. One sentence. Only one. This is the first time I've ever seen myself. Maren looked at him. The right corner of her mouth lifted, slightly. Only one side, exactly the way she always smiled. She said nothing more. Neither did he. They sat there together on the old wooden dock, the place where they had first met. The sky slowly grew brighter. The line of the eastern horizon shifted from gray to pale pink, then gold. The first sunlight of the new day touched the river, and the surface caught the light, shimmering, gentle, and the two of them sat inside that light, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, because there are moments when words only make smaller the thing that silence is still holding whole. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling stories we bring each day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment so we can hear the emotions rising from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.